Hello, I'm Eric Topol, and this is Medicine and the Machine podcast. And I'm with my co host, Dr. Abraham Verghese. And we've got a really great opportunity today to have a conversation with Dr. Helen Ouyang, who is an associate professor at Columbia University. She's an emergency medicine physician and one of the really outstanding physician authors of our time. So, welcome, Helen.
Thank you so much. I feel like I'm in the presence of greatness. So
Oh, no.
thank you for having me on.
You're much too humble. You're an incredible force. And while we're going to eventually get to your most recent New York Times Magazine cover article, one of several on the hospital makes a house call. Before we get into that, I thought we could trace back. I know you've had an incredible education background at Brown, at Hopkins, a master's of public health at Harvard, Brigham, emergency room training, all this stuff. But you have differentiated from being a great physician, a great emergency doctor, with being an author. How did that get started?
You want the short story or the long story?
Well, medium story.
I think I was taking a writing class. I think I was in 7th grade. It was one of those summer writing classes because I loved reading. I loved writing. And we read this beautiful story by Dr. Richard Seltzer, who was a surgeon at Yale. It was called Imelda, and he wrote about how he went to Honduras and worked there and did cranioplasty on kids' faces. So I was just really struck by the story. I was like, I really want to work overseas. And fast forward many years, I did that for a long time, but I always returned to writing and his writing specifically until I found out more recently that a lot of his work was fictionalized, but his words stuck with me. And I think that was sort of when it was planted.
Helen, welcome. It's such a pleasure to, put a voice to the writing that I really have enjoyed. It's interesting that you mentioned Dick Seltzer, because I think in many ways he was one of the people who helped me sort of think about the possibility of writing. I remember my brother gave me his book when I was a medical student, and I was blown away. I mean, just first of all, because he was a surgeon, and somehow the stereotype that I had as a medical student was that surgeons did anything but write this touching prose that he was capable of. And I had the opportunity to meet him many, many years later in life. So that's so interesting. But tell us what your first step was then. So you got into an interest in writing, but what was the actual moment of breakthrough, if you would?
Well, I think I was doing actually global health for a long time, including working in Kerala, India, which give a little shout out to your book that's coming out next week. So I started to write more op-eds, and I got in trouble actually with some of the nonprofits I was working with for being a little bit outspoken about circumstances in some of these humanitarian crises. So I started to peel back a little bit from global health work and do a little bit more writing. And initially it was a lot more essays and op-eds. And then I really wanted to dig deeper and spend more time with subjects. And that's kind of how I worked my way more into long form feature writing.
Well, you've certainly been doing that. And you've become a regular at the New York Times Magazine with cover features, but also many other places of high regard, New Yorker, New York, Harper's, Atlantic. I mean, you're all over, and you're very prolific. So when you pick a topic, how do you decide, how you're going to delve into it, your reporting and where it's going to go? And, how do you figure out when you have a topic of interest, what to do with it?
I have to confess, I don't always know. I mean, I have to report it out. I talk to people and I see what they say. So oftentimes I don't know how the story is going to go, and I don't know if I'll have access. But I think I often just pick issues that I think there's more to the story. I had written a piece about compassionate use in Harper's, and I think that's how we both first interacted on Twitter, Eric, because I think you tweeted out that piece and we started to communicate after that. But the storyline was that there was a child who had cancer and he needed an experimental drug, and that there was an evil CEO that didn't want to give it to him. And that was sort of the story in the media. And I was really interested in the backstory because I don't think most people are pure good or pure evil. And I wanted to see what was actually going on there. So it's often issues like that that I dig into, but it's often unpredictable what happens when you start reporting.
The amount of research that you have to do is really quite striking. I'm just struck by, how deep you dig into things. I think we're probably going to get into your most recent article about hospital at home. And, it was not only edifying, but I was struck by, it was like writing a research paper. You really have to go to all the sources and find the references and read them. And would that be a fair description of the process?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And also finding people who can carry the narrative in a compelling way, right? So I need to talk to people who can tell their stories and can kind of give light and color to the issue.
Well, just to give a flavor to our listeners, you wrote in 2021 about the pandemic and some of your own experience as well as colleagues and looking after patients in the midst of probably the worst crisis in New York City when it hit. You wrote about the children in Pakistan with HIV. You wrote about the metaverse and virtual reality for pain in 2022. And then the most recent one, as Abraham just mentioned, the hospital makes a house call. So that's just the New York Times Magazine in the recent couple of years, okay? Not all the other things you've been writing. I did want to drill down a bit on the hospital at home because this is a big movement that started and it was kind of laying dormant as you went through in your feature. For years, there were these programs like at Columbia and Mount Sinai and others that had relatively small numbers of patients treated at home with clinicians, nurses at the home, not sensors, not modern kind of AI technology and algorithms, but there certainly seemed to be some promise. Then it seemed like the pandemic took it to a new level because all of a sudden there was this waiver for 250 hospitals in the U.S.
Right.
that would get paid the same for a hospital at home as they would get in a hospital. So where are we headed with this?
Yes, as you said, once the waiver hit, suddenly everyone was interested because you can get reimbursed as if you were in a brick and mortar hospital, but you were at home. And once you take away some of the overhead costs and food and room and board, then the costs are cheaper. So, it makes economic sense. I think we were already sort of heading that way, that people wanted their care at home. But I think the pandemic accelerated not only because of the waiver, but also people were used to seeing their doctors in their living rooms and using telehealth. That became much more popular during the pandemic and it kind of stuck. And I think even though it's gone down some since the pandemic has waned, a lot of people are used to it now and comfortable with it. And then I think technology has really moved in that direction, how you could do remote monitoring at home with the patients that you weren't able to do a few decades ago. So I think all of those forces are really going to push hospital at home.
I was struck by the fact that, even though CMS did some progressive things like quickly funding telemedicine and so on, in a way, they remain a big obstacle to fully implementing some of these programs. Is that their obstinacy? Is that just red tape? Or does one really need to have the enormous scale of a Kaiser Permanente for this to be worthwhile to CMS? I didn't quite understand why they weren't on board with something that should save them money.
I think sometimes people are used to doing things a certain way, and there's a lot of variables once you're in somebody's home, right? Your home is different from another person's home versus hospital rooms are often similar pairing, the same equipment. Once you go home, there's so many different things that can go differently for people, including distance from the hospital. How will you get back to the hospital? What if there are dogs at home? What if you have a roommate that doesn't want someone else there? I think all of these variables come into play, and it feels like a much less controlled and scary environment.
Well, as George Orwell put it many years ago, the hospital is the antechamber to the tomb. And of course, the problem here is that we have lots of errors, nosocomial infections, and people can't sleep. You can't eat the food. I mean, there's all sorts of problems in the hospital that. And then there's this other front, not just facilitated by a reimbursement, but the idea that, which really wasn't so much in the piece, but it's looking into the future, towards the future, about connect a person with the appropriate sensors. You could get continuous vital signs, for example. You have cameras if you need. You have, mats for walking and gait disturbance or frailty, or prone to falls, all sorts of ambient sensing and algorithms. Do you see a time when this will become very popular, Helen, or is it still, because of the absence of the human touch, the presence in the room of the bedroom of the person or their home, that it just is inconceivable?
I mean, I think it's going to be, some forward, a little backwards. I'm sure, unfortunately, in medicine, it's unpredictable, and perhaps something will go wrong for patient and people will become more cautious. It'll be a little bit of a staggering forward step, but I still think the movement is in that direction. And, Abraham mentions CMS, they're almost sort of acting like the startup funding for this in a way, right? They're paying for this and they know it costs less, but they're doing it because that's how they're going to get institutions to invest in it. Or else who's going to take that up? Nobody wants to be the first to go, pay a lot for something, and end up losing money.
You did a great job of telling us about the history of being hospitalized and how we've slowly gone from everyone being at home to this model where we really think that we have to have nurses around the clock, and it has to be this model or nothing. There's no in between. You could be in the street homeless and getting no care, or you have to be in the most expensive care in the world. And what was also surprising to me was the resistance that came, I thought, from an unexpected quarter, and that is from the nurses. The nursing profession as a whole is against this movement, and why would that be? What's the rationale there?
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say nurses as a whole, but I think the largest nursing union that I wrote about, they're against it because, I mean, I think there's, again, fear of what could go wrong at home. I mean, they're at the bedside, they're monitoring the patient, they're observing the patient, and to take all of that out and to bring patients at home. And CMS, they were pretty loose with this waiver. I mean, it only requires 2 nursing visits a day, and those visits can be virtual. So there has to be 2 in-person visits. So that could come from, in some states, like a medic or a physician extender, but the nursing visits actually could be virtual. So I think that is a huge change from what we do in the hospital. And maybe we'll realize a few years down the road that we actually need to rein it in a little bit, and there needs to be more nursing visits. I'm not sure, but I think the setup right now is quite different from what we experience in a brick and mortar hospital.
Yeah, and certainly the American Hospital Association isn't going to be getting in back of this movement, because that's kind of their financial model. But speaking of models, with GPT-4, which is now multimodal, bringing in images and video, text and speech, we have the first opportunity now, using this large language model, generative AI, whatever you prefer for the term, to actually do the validation, do the randomized trials. So, in your piece, you touched on the randomized trials, 60 of them from 2012, which already showed an advantage of the hospital at home versus the hospital. And that was, of course, without some of the opportunities we have now. But clearly, it's going to need a lot of work to provide that proof and to take on the entities that have a conflict. The US isn't so well positioned for this because hospitals account for a third of the healthcare $4 trillion plus dollars. So they're not going to be very inclined to let go, and all these facilities built around the country. But other countries, which are more interested in just providing the best care without a perverse incentive, if you will. Do you see that also, Helen, as an issue for how this goes forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think the hospitals, in a way, don't have a choice. As I sort of alluded to in the article, I mean, I think everything is pushing the direction of home, for good or for bad. I mean, I think the pandemic accelerated a lot of that. So I think, there's these companies out there, like one's called Dispatch. I'll just say one, where you're basically bypassing the front doors of the hospital. So a patient, if they're want to reach out to dispatch about, let's say they have some cold symptoms, then somebody will come to their house, usually a physician assistant, and then they will get the x-ray company to come to your house. They take an x-ray and it looks like you have pneumonia. Well, they'll just hospitalize you at home. So that's what the hospital's contending against. So I think whether they like it or not, whether they have beds that are empty or they've built new buildings, I think you're going to have to think in that direction at least a little bit.
I think, as Eric was saying, the incentives are all around reimbursement. And it seemed like from reading your article that the only hospital systems that were interested were those that were also insuring their own group of patients. Otherwise, hospitalizing someone at home loses them money. Would that be a fair statement, that if a hospital isn't part of a healthcare system that they're insuring their own patients, they wouldn't be incentivized to be doing very much in this space?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true for now. Moving forward, I think if private insurers start to insure, and if they insure at good enough rates, then maybe it'll be a good proposition for other hospital systems. But I think you're right. It's really the hospital systems who have their own insurance programs who are saving the money right now.
So one of the things I wanted to get into beyond this hot topic, HAH as it's getting known as, is the intersection of your career in academic medicine and as a physician author. And the fact that great institutions like places like Columbia University, they may not recognize, and I'd get Abraham to comment on this as well, of course, they may not recognize that this is actually a major contribution, not just for the medical community, but for the public in terms of, it's not like it's a paper in Science or the New England Journal. It's a paper that has a much bigger audience. It's making vast contributions as to, knowledge and progress and limitations, just like, for example, you raised in that recent piece about a company like Bioformis, that's one of the tech companies leading this hospital at home, and it has problems. I mean, you brought this out. So you have a much broader reach and impact than the things in our microcosm that appear in some leading journal, but the university may not actually understand how big and important it is. So could you comment on that?
Well, first of all, Eric, you've been a huge cheerleader in that department, so I'm going to thank you for that. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think traditional academic institutions that I'm at, that Abraham is at, but I'll let you speak more to it, Abraham. And, they really value traditional research and education. But I think, there are more and more medical students who are interested in writing. I think narrative medicine has really pushed to the forefront. So I think there is a space for it, but often it does feel like I'm working in parallel or in silo.
Yeah, I would just say that things have come a long way. I think that when I started out, this was not something you told many people about. You just did it on the side and, pleasantly surprised people when something came out, but I don't think they saw it as much added value. And then gradually, there was sort of a PR value to it. And I think first at the University of Texas, San Antonio, and then especially at Stanford, I really felt that those institutions at least had embraced the idea that my output was going to be slightly different from, the scientist, but it was equivalent in its own way. I mean, you have to use a different metric to calculate it. So I think, things are opening up. There's a sense that this is of value, that we need people to communicate the science in some fashion to the public. And it's a form of creativity, academic freedom, all that. So I think in many ways, people like Richard Seltzer have helped to open the door for careers like yours, which is really gratifying. But I want to, if I may, Eric, switch gears and ask you a little bit about an element that struck me in your writing, and that is you're exposed to pretty incredible dangers in some of these situations where you're going to. I was reading the piece about HIV from needle misuse in Pakistan, and just picturing you there, it must have been quite challenging. And then you're in the middle of that when COVID breaks out, I gather, because your piece on COVID begins with you being in Karachi, and then you wind up, I guess you wind up in Italy. But so talk a bit about, that sense of vulnerability you must feel when you go out there like this to strange places.
You're such an astute reader that you picked up that I was in Karachi at the beginning of the COVID piece. But, I had worked overseas for over a decade on and off, so I didn't necessarily feel unsafe. And actually, I had worked in Pakistan before under totally different circumstances after the earthquake over a decade ago. So I didn't feel necessarily unsafe then, but it felt actually just sort of returning to a place that I had been before.
Interesting. Well, one of the themes that comes across your work, which interestingly is intersects with Abraham as well, is the humanistic aspects. Like in the hospital, it was about the human touch, and of course, in the piece that Abraham just mentioned, this is to me also something that resonates, that we lose touch with in medicine. And you bring it back, for your readers. Is this something that that you find thematic? I mean, you may go into something that's highly technical, like the metaverse and virtual reality, but you bring it back to the humanistic aspects. So I wonder about that, and what you're working on now.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it always comes back to people, the situations they're in, the decisions they make, how they behave, and bringing that to life. I think for me, it would be very hard to write a story without that human touch, without human characters driving the narrative and us seeing what happens to them. So that's like always first and foremost when I'm looking at stories and considering them and talking to people, see how they will bring an issue to life.
Is that part of your next chapter or the next feature, or you don't want to give it?
I can't talk about what I'm writing about, but it's a little bit controversial, so I'm actually a little bit nervous, and it's a little bit more topical than person driven, so narrative. So
okay,
we'll see what happens.
We won't press you on it. Go ahead.
Hopefully
Abraham.
it works out.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about where the general direction of your career you think is where would you want it to go? Are you looking to continue the way you're doing as a, just a wonderful, I would call it investigative journalism with a very medical bent, or what else do you see coming down the pike?
I honestly don't know. I mean, I love writing magazine features. I think they're just the perfect length for me in terms of, and both the time I spend with it and the length of reading. I like reporting. I love writing. I actually always have huge admiration for people who can write fiction and nonfiction, such as yourself. So that's something I always toy with in the back of my mind about writing fiction, but I am not even close to doing that yet. But yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think right now I want to continue writing magazine features for as long as I can.
Over the weekend, I read a book by an author, a physician author who I didn't know, Jennifer Lysette. It's called The Algorithm Will See You Now. And what was interesting about this book, which is the horror show, sci-fi of the future of AI in 2035, everything that could possibly go wrong, right? But it's a nightmare. But what I was interested to read is that the reason she got into this as a writer is that she was suffering terrible burnout, and she turned to writing as a remedy. And I wonder if there's a lot of physicians out there, a lot of clinicians out there who are suffering from burnout in a spectrum. What does writing do for you in terms of your sense of fulfillment, your mood, your complementarity with your medical responsibilities in the emergency department? What does that do for you?
Well, I have to admit, Eric, that writing causes me a tremendous amount of stress. So I don't know if it's quite therapeutic for me as it is for a lot of people, but I will say in reporting, I've noticed for me, it's like the time I don't get to spend with patients in the emergency room, I love that I get to spend that when I'm reporting. It's just hours talking to patients and their personal lives and everything that's going on with them and not feeling rushed at all. I mean, I think definitely reporting gives me that. And then when I'm writing, reflecting back on that. So that time that I don't get to have with patients in the emergency room because it's so busy and chaotic, I really love that I can have that when I'm reporting and writing.
Well, we want to see you keep doing this. You're clearly hitting your stride, and I mean, each piece that I read in preparation for this was just in its own way quite different from the previous one, and just seemed like you were discovering different ways of cracking the code of that story, and so it was really interesting to observe. Good luck to you.
Thank you so much.
You are really amazing, Helen. You're such a talent and in many ways unique as to your approach to this. I think it's inevitable you'll be writing books in the future. That's the way, at least I see it. But the magazine features are a pretty good warm up for that. And as you say, the length is probably more conducive. But then you could work like Abraham for 6 years for his 720-page tome. You know, you could do that too. At any rate, this has been a joy to have you. An interview that's long overdue. We are in awe of what you've been contributing. We think universities should recognize this much more than they do. In particular, Columbia University, I would say. Maybe they're starting to wake up here. But we'll be cheering for you and reading all your pieces in the future because they're impactful. We hope this conversation will light things up for those people who haven't already been in touch with the work that you do, which is really extraordinary. So thank you for that. And we look forward in the future, hopefully, to reconvene on some more of your work and go through it. So Helen, thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you both so much.